One of the fascinating things about Escombe Church here is that it's much closer in date to the time of Jesus himself than it is to our day. It was built within 700 years of the time of Jesus, and we are now 1400 more years out beyond that. But it isn't just that. We're surrounded here by old tombstones from several different periods, and a lot of them have got inscriptions which actually tell you what people believed about life after death and what hope there might be. So there's one inscription here which has a nice little poem which actually expresses the classic Christian hope. It says, "Go home, dear friends, and leave us here, and let us lay till Christ appear. When Christ appears, we hope to have a joyful rising from the grave." Now that is the mainstream Christian hope. We're resting here at the moment. This isn't the end of the story. Jesus is going to return, and when he returns, there will be a resurrection. All these graves, like in all English churchyards, they're all facing east, so that it was assumed that Jesus would rise like the sun in the east, and then they would all stand up to greet him when he arrived. That is the classic Christian hope. But for many, for the last 150 years or so, the hope has been transformed into something quite different. It's just about, for many people now, going to heaven when you die. No mention of resting and then something else, no mention of a bodily resurrection, just an abandoning of this world and a flying off somewhere else. And indeed, in this very churchyard, there are some of the graves which tell it like that. So many people are confused about this that it's really important we study it carefully. And that's what this session is going to be all about. So what exactly happened to Jesus 3 days after he was executed? Why did the early Christians use that strange word resurrection when they wanted to say what they thought had happened? And what can we say about our view of what they were thinking? To answer those quite interesting questions, I found it helpful to go back and track a bit through what people in the first century believed about what happened to people after they died. You can divide those views broadly into two, ancient pagan views and ancient Jewish views. The ancient pagans had a whole range of things they believed. After all, some of the Roman emperors believed that when they died, they were going to become gods and their female family goddesses. But there were many other views as well. Some ancient pagans just believed that when you died, that was it, that was the end. You find on some ancient tombstones a little Latin tag which basically means, once upon a time I wasn't, once I was, now I'm not, and I don't care. That was quite a common view in those days. But there were others who took a more cheerful view that your body would die and decay, but that your soul would go somewhere really nice and pleasant and live there for a long time. Or others of them believed that your soul would rest a while and then would come back into a different body. You would turn into somebody else, and so on and so on. There are lots of variations on those beliefs. The Jewish people had less variety, but still some. Some of them seem to have believed that death really was the end. Some of them seem to have believed that the soul would go off somewhere else. But interestingly, leading up to the period of the time of Jesus, a significant number of Jewish people really did believe that one day, not instantly, but that one day, God would raise from the dead all his people, perhaps even the whole human race, but certainly all his people or all his righteous people. And when they used that resurrection idea, they didn't mean a soul going off into the blue yonder. They meant somebody being raised from the dead physically so that they were really themselves again, perhaps even more so. So we have to ask the question, not only why did the early Christians say that that's what happened to Jesus, but interestingly, what did they think would happen to them and to all people sooner or later? This is particularly striking because across many cultures, including contemporary cultures, the things that people believe about life after death, the things they say about that, somebody's funeral for instance, tend to be very conservative. You tend to say pretty much what people said to you when you were young, because it's a time, a very solemn time, for sticking with what you know and where the tradition has left you. But fascinatingly, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence right across the first 100 and 200 years of Christianity, they all said that what was going to happen was resurrection. In other words, they went for one option and only one option out of that whole range of ancient pagan and Jewish worldviews. So it's a question that the historian has to ask. Why did they all change their minds and go for this one? They had other options. Why did they plump for this and only this? Of course, their answer was, the reason we're going this route is that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. So we have to go back and look at the stories they told about what had happened. And when we go back to the books we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, we find that each of them tells the story of the first Easter day in some significantly different ways. And that's fascinating because, you know, if they'd got together 40 or 50 years later and said, it's time we actually wrote up a story that'll convince people, they wouldn't have done it like that. They'd have cobbled it together and made sure that all the details matched exactly. But the stories don't look like that. They look more like what you'd get if there was an extraordinary event, a road accident or a plane crash or something, and everyone in the breathless hours after that happened telling it like they'd seen it, often with bits and pieces of details upside down and inside out. That's a bit how the Gospels read at that point. But there are other odd things about those stories which make me as a historian think that they really have the ring of this is how they told it at the beginning. For instance, very interestingly, the women, Jesus' followers who were women, play a very significant and striking role in all of them. The men are away hiding somewhere. Jesus' male followers thought that the authorities were going to come after them as well. But the women were the first at the tomb, and they were the first to go and tell people. Now, feminists among us may think, well, isn't that great? Fine, and pass on. But it's more interesting than that, because in the first century world, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. In other words, again, if you were making up these stories 5 weeks or 50 years later, you would never have invented women as your primary witnesses. But there they are, front and center in the stories. Something very strange is going on here. In addition, the portrait of Jesus in those resurrection stories is fascinating because in some of the Jewish speculations about resurrection, they seem to be saying that people will come back exactly as they were before, no change, back into the same body, the same sort of physical life, and you'll just have it all over again. Whereas others among the people who speculate about resurrection seem to be saying that when we're raised, we'll be like stars in the heaven, we'll be shining like heavenly bodies. Interestingly, in the stories in the Gospels, neither of those is true. Obviously, Jesus is not shining like a star. They would have said that if that had been how it was. He appears to begin with as somebody just like them, and he eats and he drinks with them, and he can be touched. But then there are very strange things that happen as well, because sometimes he appears and disappears, and sometimes they don't know quite what's going on. Is he really there? They thought he was a ghost, and then it turns out he isn't after all. And again, I have to say, if they'd been making up stories later in order to say, there you are, he's really physical after all, they wouldn't have done it like this. One of the leading scholars of our day, who is not himself actually a practicing Christian, has put it like this: it looks as if they were trying to say something for which they knew they didn't have very good language. In other words, something new is going on here. What was it, this new thing? Well, we can track back historically and say that the only way that they would have told stories like that was if two particular things had happened. On the one hand, there must really have been an empty tomb which they knew was Jesus' tomb. And on the other hand, there must have been meetings with someone, sightings of someone who they took to be Jesus himself. If you didn't have the first, they would have said that those sightings were just hallucinations. They knew as much about hallucinations as we do. If you didn't have the second, they would have said, oh, well, the tomb has been robbed. Tomb robbery was quite common in the ancient world, particularly of well-known people, because robbers would hope that there might be jewels or other valuable goods in the grave with them. It really does look as though the tomb was empty and there were real meetings with Jesus. And you can go through all the options, all the skeptical accounts of, oh, well, it must have been like this or that or the other. But actually, I and many others have done that. And the answer is nope, they don't work. They don't explain the rise of the early Christian faith. The only way to explain it is to say that Jesus hadn't just been resuscitated back into the same life. He had done something quite new. He had gone, as it were, through death and out the other side with a new sort of body, of which there had been no previous example, and of which to this day there remains no subsequent instance. Now the skeptic will say, well, that's utterly ridiculous, and the early Christians knew then that it was indeed ridiculous, and many people said that. But actually they discovered that what they said about their experience of meeting Jesus and knowing him to be alive somehow began to change everything. And they discovered that resurrection wasn't just something that happened to Jesus. Resurrection meant that God's new creation had begun. The new world had already started, not with a great bang and suddenly everything being transformed overnight, but with this one prototypical event which was going to generate and drive a whole new world. And you can see that they believe that in the way that they tell the stories. In John's Gospel, in chapter 20, when he is describing what happened on that very first Easter day, he reminds us that it was the first day of the week. And a little bit later in the chapter, he says it's the first day of the week. And you might think, well, what's so special about that? And the answer is John has written his gospel very carefully, in such a way as to remind us of the great sequence in the book of Genesis, the great sequence of creation. And he's now saying, this is a new creation. This is the first day of the new week. Because the point that he's making, as they all do, is that the story doesn't go like this. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, therefore that's all right, we get to go to heaven. No, resurrection is about a new bodily life in this world and for this world. What they are saying is that the resurrection of Jesus means that God's new creation has begun, and therefore we have a job to do. Our calling then in the light of Easter is to be, as it were, advance foretastes of that new creation. That is to say, we are to be in ourselves both the beneficiaries of it and the agents of it. What exactly does that mean? It means, to begin with, that the power which was launched at Easter was like a great explosion of God's new power in the whole world. That power is to transform our lives. That's what happens when somebody discovers that the message of Jesus seems to be bubbling up inside them and making them think and feel and behave differently. But it's never just something for ourselves. Jesus spoke earlier in John's Gospel about the living water which he would give, but he didn't just say, I'll give you the living water for you. He says that you are to be somebody out of whom that living water will flow. And for somebody living in the Middle East then or now, living water is pretty important. If you're in the desert, you need that water. You need fresh water to drink, to be refreshed, to stop from starving and getting totally overheated. Our lives are to be like that. God's intention is to flood the dry and dusty creation with his new life, and we are to be people through whom that happens. And that can be through the gifts that God has given us of maybe creativity, of artistic work, through the passion that God gives us to make justice happen in his world. It can be through the tenderness and kindness that we find bubbling up within ourselves to go and look after people who badly need it. And so often in our world, there are plenty of people very close at hand who come into that category. One way or another, we are to be, as I said, not only the beneficiaries for ourselves of that new creation, we are to be people through whom it happens out there in God's world.